This is retired Reverend Officer McGarry, and welcome to Talkin' Tax Smart. Today I wanted to round out our discussion in regard to identification numbers as they're assigned to accounts and how the Internal Revenue uses this information to be able to process your tax returns. So what we're going to look at first of all is individuals and then briefly touch on business. So the important thing here to understand and remember is that normally for individuals, what we're going to be talking about is that an individual will use their Social Security number. Now, back in the day, I'm old enough to remember back in the day, not when Social Security began, which was back in 1938 when it was signed into law. But I do remember talking to some taxpayers, and they were telling me about the fact that they had, for married couples, they had a joint return that would one Social Security number, which was given to a married couple. They would have the same Social Security number, but the spouse would have an A designator after it. And I ran into a couple of these when I was working accounts. They were interesting, but normally the Internal Revenue uses the Social Security number for an individual as their identification when they file taxes, and that's the reason why when you come into this country legally as an immigrant, for example, or when you are born into this country, your parents being citizens, you take that information of birth and you take that information that you received and you use that information in order to go to the Social Security Administration and obtain a Social Security card. And that Social Security card, the number for that will then track you all through life. So you use that not for identification purposes, as in saying to a police officer who stops you or somebody who says, hey, do you have some kind of ID? Your Social Security card or number is not used for that purpose. It is to identify you with the Social Security Administration, which the Internal Revenue Service has a relationship with, because the Internal Revenue Service it uses your Social Security number, and in part because your Social Security payment, your payment towards employment taxes for money that you earn as an employee, your Social Security number is used in order to make sure that you get benefit of those withholdings that are done by your employer. So the Social Security number becomes very, very important and is issued to you for the purpose of you being able to identify yourself on a federal tax return, as well as have that information available to Social Security Administration. Now, I'll have a subsequent video where I'll talk about employment taxes and the intricacies of how employment taxes work. But essentially, I have stated in a past video that the genius of the Internal Revenue Service and how it's set up is that employers are essentially enlisted as agents to collect Social Security and Medicare upfront from you as you receive your monies, and then they turn that information in over to the Social Security Administration and the Internal Revenue Service, respectively. So the Social Security number becomes very important. So if you're here legally, you're born here, or you immigrate to this country legally, or you are a permanent resident, then all of these things can qualify you for Social Security number. And what you do is you go with documentation to the Social Security Administration, and you present to the Social Security Administration the information that you have, and then they would be responsible to validate that information and issue a Social Security card. So when we look on our computer system and we look up somebody, we're looking for what is your Social Security number. If it's a married filing joint return, we're looking for both Social Security numbers on a single return because you have two entities that are blended into one. But if you're a single entity of some nature as an individual, then you're going to have a Social Security number. If you have dependents that you're taking on your return, you're going to have a Social Security number for those dependents. Now, for those individuals that do not have a Social Security number, you can apply to the Internal Revenue Service for an identification number called an ITIN, and the one that we'll talk about first is the adoption identification number. So if you're adopting somebody, they do not have a Social Security number, and that information is not available. There is a form that you can fill out, a W-7, which is used for you to request an identification number for that individual if they have not had, if they do not have identification. Now, it may be that they're being adopted. If they're being adopted in the United States, that's really not a problem. They should have the necessary records available to get a Social Security number through the Social Security Administration. But if you've got a foreign adoption where there wouldn't be any identification, then you would have to get what is called an ITIN. And an ITIN is a number which is assigned by the Internal Revenue Service to give so that you can put that individual on a tax return, or subsequently that individual would be able to file a tax return if they eventually do not get U.S. citizenship and are able to then apply to Social Security Administration for an identification number. The next number that you'll see that applies to individuals is a number which is an ITIN, and the ITIN is an identification number which is given to individuals that are not legally able to secure a Social Security number. These are individuals that are in this country illegally. They have entered for various reasons illegally, but they are able to find some type of an employment. And so here's the interesting wrinkle, is that if you're in this country illegally, you are not allowed to work. So the ITIN is not does not give you the ability to work. What it does do is, if in fact you are hired by somebody, in order for them to pay you, they have to have an identification number to do federal tax withholding on, and you would then be subject to the normal withholding of Social Security, Medicare, and even income tax withholding. Remember that what started this whole discussion is the mantra, as it were, that I have told you before. If you're going to play, you need to pay. And as far as the Internal Revenue Service is concerned, if you are not able to get a legitimate number for them to track you so that they can make sure that you are paying like you're supposed to, then you can apply with a W-7 and get an ITIN. Now, let me just say a brief caveat before we move on from this, that this is one place where I would note that we see the integrity of the Internal Revenue Service in regard to confidentiality. The Internal Revenue, with the application for an ITIN and with an ITIN being assigned, has the information available practically to track down anybody who is in this country illegally and is receiving some type of income, that is working when they're not supposed to. Our immigration laws are set up in such a way that if you're here illegally, you do not have the right to work. Remember, the ITIN is not giving you the right to work. It allows the Internal Revenue to track that which you are making, because any income that you make is subject to U.S. taxation as part of the IRS code. So they have the ability to track that information. And if they were to share that information with, say, Immigration and Naturalization Service, it would be easy to track down where people who are here illegally are working and to take action to remove them from this country. But the Internal Revenue Service values confidentiality so much that it does not disclose this information to any other agency that is not allowed by law to have it. And therefore, even if you are here illegally, even if you are securing some type of illegal employment, and you are providing an ITIN to an employer so that you can do what you need to, that information is not shared with anybody. The only two agencies that it would have access to that information as a need-to-know basis is the Internal Revenue Service and Social Security Administration. As I said, without getting into the weeds and going into a different video, Social Security Administration gets this information first. Your W-2s, which are sent to you at the end of the tax year, are first sent to Social Security Administration so that you can get credit for what you've worked, and that goes into your record for figuring out what Social Security will be when you become eligible to collect it. And then that information, after they get that information, they send that to the Internal Revenue Service. So there's a system that is put in place. But aside from those two agencies, that information is not available. The ITIN is what we're talking about. That is not available to any other agency, and the Internal Revenue values confidentiality so much that it will not even disclose that to other federal agencies who might take action against those that are breaking our laws. That being said, the other type of identification, which is under ITINs, are a couple of numbers that really don't pertain to the normal individuals, so I won't talk about those. Now, the second number which is given, I talked about this briefly in my last video, is the employer identification number. And let me just back up before I go to the employer identification number. You know, back in the day, I'll just give you a little caveat. Back in the day, people used to take their dogs and their cats, and I mean, you might wonder why it is that people have to have an identification number. Because people used to take their dogs and their cats and their fish and whatever and claim them as dependents. And part of the Tax Reform Act of 1986 was to require that any individual that is going to be on a tax return is going to have a Social Security number. That's for adults, that's for children. If you're here legally, you're going to have a Social Security number, or if you're here illegally, you're going to have an ITIN, so that no longer could people take questionable deductions and claim them as dependents on their tax returns. And so the Tax Reform Act of 1986 kind of sewed that up. So with that said, for people who then have a business and they're operating a business, they need an employer identification number. And that number is assigned by the Internal Revenue Service, whether you are a sole proprietor, a corporation, or a partnership. Now, the caveat that I will make here is that so if you're self-employed, then you don't have to have, as far as federal tax law is concerned, you don't have to have an employer identification number. The only time that you would really be required to have an employer identification number normally is if you have employees, then there needs to be an identification number assigned to you separate from your social security number. But if you're just filing your tax return and you have no employees, then actually your social security number is what would work to identify yourself. However, in recent years, the banks have made it very clear that even though that is the case, as far as the Internal Revenue is concerned, they will not give you a business account. So you cannot go into a bank as a business and say, I want to open an account for my business using my social security number. They won't do that. They will require you to get an employer identification number, even if you're a sole proprietor and have no employees, so that there is no confusion over the commingling of funds. Remember that if you're an individual, what you get privately and you use your money for, that is separate from what you use money for, which is designated specifically for business. And so the banks have made it clear that they simply are not going to accept an individual opening up a bank account, even if the factors that I indicated are true. You have no employees. If you want a business account, they're going to require you to apply to the Internal Revenue Service, even as a sole proprietor, to get an employer identification number so that you would separate personal and business activities as far as income is concerned. So, what did we learn today? Well, basically speaking, what we learned is that the Internal Revenue Service uses identification numbers in order to identify both individual and business accounts. They guard the information that is given to each individual vigorously, and they only use these identification numbers for the purpose of you filing your tax return and or getting credit for taxes which would have been withheld, whether you're here legally or illegally. Why is that? Well, again, the government believes that as long as you're going to be involved in the economy of the United States, they want their fair share up front, because if you're going to play, you have to pay.